Hey, Katie. We have Password to Larkspur Lane. We are on Chapter 14, The Matching Necklace. As Nancy's eyes fluttered open, she saw Bess's anxious face bending over her. "Oh, thank goodness!" Bess exclaimed. "She's coming to." George and Mrs. Corning stood at the other side of the bed. "You're in your room, dear," said Mrs. Corning. "How do you feel?" Nancy sat up, frowning. "My head aches, but otherwise I'm all right. What happened?" "The boys found you on the driveway," said George. "The gang got away." She explained that the boys had seen 3 men scuffling, and finally one had been carried off through the woods. By the time the boys had rescued Nancy, their search for the others was hopeless. "They took Morgan then?" Nancy asked. "I was afraid of that." She told how she had been pulled away from the houseman. "Lucky the thug didn't know it was you," said George, "or you'd have been kidnapped too." "The boys are waiting down in the kitchen," Bess put in. "I'll go down and tell them you're awake." "Let's all go," said Nancy. "I think I could do with a glass of milk and some crackers, if you don't mind, Mrs. Corning." The woman's face broke into a smile, and she said, "That's the best news I've heard yet. Now I know you're feeling better." As Bess and George served cake and glasses of milk, Nancy and the boys exchanged stories. Dave raised his glass of milk. "Here's to General Drew." The others echoed the toast enthusiastically. "I guess I wasn't such a good general tonight," said Nancy. "I certainly lost the battle." "The campaign's not over," Bert told her cheerfully. Ned smiled and patted Nancy's shoulder. "Better luck tomorrow." Mrs. Corning cleared her throat. "Nancy, dear, I'm afraid we'd better—" "Oh, please, Mrs. Corning, I know what you're going to say, that I'd better give up the case, but please give me another day to find out exactly what's going on at Larkspur Lane." Ned and the others backed up Nancy's plea. Mrs. Corning hesitated. "Well, all right, but we can't wait longer than tomorrow night." "I'll do my best to solve the mystery by then," Nancy said quietly. To herself she added, "And no mistakes, Nancy Drew." Next morning the girls again started out early. As before, Nancy hid in the back of the car and George drove. The sky was overcast, but Nancy's spirits were light. Some miles from the lake she took the wheel, her eyes shining with excitement. "I don't see how you can be so cheerful," Bess grumbled. "You were knocked out last night, and now you're going into even more danger." Nancy smiled. "I never felt better." Familiar with the way now, she was able to make good time to the spot where the sign L.S. Lane marked the battle line. "We're in enemy territory now," she remarked. "From now on, caution must be our password." Nancy drove past the half-concealed driveway and into the woods, where she parked the car behind a tangle of creeper and bittersweet. Like creeper vines. They're called that because they creep onto other trees and plants, I believe. "No one will notice it here," Nancy said. "Now let's strike through the woods ahead and see how close we can come to the house without using the road." Cautiously, the girls worked their way around bramble and bush until the roof of the gatehouse came into view. They crept closer, and looks of dismay came over their faces. Tilted back in a chair against the gate-post was a man whom Nancy assumed was the gatekeeper. At his feet lay a brindled Great Dane, his tongue lolling and his eyes alert. Brindle is a color for dog. It's like a brown and black color, I believe. Nancy gasped. "That's the beast that tackled me at the flower show," she whispered. "Let's hope he doesn't scent us." George said, "There's certainly no chance of getting in there. Let's go on." Nancy led the way to the right, still well within the trees, always keeping the tall fence with its border of larkspur in view. After trudging through the woods for a quarter of a mile, the girls found that the fence turned to the left. It continued in a straight line up the shallow slope along flower-lined enclosure. "Ugh, it's rough traveling," Bess shuddered. "I'm afraid of snakes." "Want to wait here?" George asked. "I certainly do not," Bess retorted. "I'd be scared to death by myself." Smothering her fears, Bess followed Nancy and George through the tangled undergrowth. At one point, they came to a place where a clump of trees partially concealed the house. Nancy called a halt for rest and consultation. She and George sat down. "This wouldn't be a good spot to climb the fence," George observed, leaning back on her elbows. "You'd rip your skirt on that barbed wire." Nancy looked at her in surprise. "You'd do more than that, don't you see?" she asked, pointing to the top of the enclosure. "I see a fence and 2 strands of barbed wire stretched along the top," George replied. "Notice how the wire is fastened to those supporting posts." "It's attached to little porcelain knobs. What does that have to do with it?" "Those knobs are insulators, which means the wire is charged with electricity. If you touch it, you'll probably set off an alarm and get a bad shock besides. You could be killed." George gave a low whistle. "It's a regular fort," said Bess. "Get how peaceful it all looks." Through the wire fence, the girls could see other flower gardens, occasional clumps of trees, and a view of the rear of the gatehouse. It was truly a lovely spot, except for the sinister strands of charged wire. "Rested?" Nancy asked. "Let's go." Since they were now approaching the house, the girls moved even more warily. Bess stepped gingerly, afraid of putting her foot down on a snake. "It would be just like those people to let a couple thousand rattlesnakes and copperheads loose around here," Bess muttered. "Ugh!" The worried girl cried suddenly, and jumped sideways, clutching at her cousin. Caught off balance, George stumbled and fell, giving a muffled yelp. "What happened?" Nancy whispered excitedly, turning back to them. "I stepped into a hole and I think my ankle is sprained," George said, her face white. Nancy's heart sank. If any of them should become helplessly injured, detection would certainly follow. "Oh, it's all my fault," whispered Bess. "I'm sorry, George. I thought I stepped on something alive." Her eyes filled with tears. George managed a grin. "Take it easy. I'm not dying." Nancy knelt beside George, and with deft fingers felt the injured ankle, wishing that Dr. Spire were with them now. "I'm sure it's not broken," she said softly. George rubbed her ankle gingerly. Excuse me. "Go on, you two. I'll wait here for you." "Are you sure it's all right?" Nancy asked. "Yes, go on, please." Nancy and Bess resumed their cautious advance to the top of the rise. There they had full view of all the grounds. Surrounding the house was a wide lawn with gravel walks and flower beds. In the rear was a huge meadow which Nancy surmised was used as a landing field for the airplane. The craft was not in sight. Just below the brow of the hill, and connected with the house by a long arbor, group of trees, was a group of outbuildings, a carriage house, evidently converted into a garage, a good-sized barn, and a chicken yard. "Listen," Nancy said, raising a finger. "I heard cooing." "Pigeons!" Bess exclaimed. Excuse me. The girls moved ahead until they were behind the carriage house, where they saw a small wooden building which had no window on their side. Here they rested in the shade until aroused by a soft cooing and the sound of a man's voice. "You're getting better," the listeners heard through the wooden walls. "I guess you'll be able to work again if we keep you warm with this electric light. That'll cure you." There was more cooing. Then the unseen man said, "You ought to be ashamed taking a couple of days getting to the boss's place and arriving there lame at that. Why did you go to the Drews, you half-witted barnyard goose?" A door closed, and all was silence. "Did you hear what that man said?" Bess asked with a catch in her voice. "He mentioned your name." "Yes, that was the man I met at the Tucker's estate. I recognized his voice," Nancy said as she walked ahead. Once past the outbuildings, the girls saw a mossy-covered sundial surrounded by a grassy court. In it stood a number of wheelchairs, each occupied by an old lady. A large woman in a nurse's uniform had her back to the girls. She seemed to be administering to one of the elderly women. "It looks like a real nursing home," Bess whispered. "Perhaps our suspicions are all wrong." Nancy put a finger to her lips. The nurse turned and walked toward the fence. "That's the woman who stole my handbag," Nancy exclaimed softly. The one who took the bracelet? Yes, she's in league with Thorn and Tucker, I feel sure. One of these old ladies might be Mrs. Eldridge, Bess said. But how can we find out? I don't know yet, but I'll think of something, Nancy replied. Meanwhile, we'd better go back and help George to the car. If she were discovered, she'd have no way to escape. The girls hurried back to their companion, and the three made their way down the hill. George limped along as quickly as she could, but progress was slow. When they had nearly reached the gatehouse, the girls paused, and George sat down on a stump to rest. Suddenly, Nancy seized Bess's arm and pointed among the trees. On the other side of the wire barrier was an old woman dozing in a wheelchair. Stay here, Nancy whispered. I'm going closer. Bess clung to her friend's arm. No, suppose they catch you. I must talk to that old lady, said Nancy. She may be able to help us. Nancy crept cautiously toward the fence. When she was a few feet away, still screened by bushes, she stifled a gasp. The elderly lady wore a necklace which looked like the gold bracelet Dr. Spire had given Nancy as a clue. The missing Mrs. Eldridge, Nancy murmured excitedly. Ooh, sounds like she's reaching a break in the case. Exciting.